The espionage power ladder isn't what you think it is. Most people imagine spies as glamorous operatives with code names and high-tech gadgets. The reality is far stranger and more complex. It's a hierarchy that begins with an ordinary person who has access to something valuable and can end with someone playing both sides in a game where discovery means death. Let me show you how someone climbs that ladder and why the view from the top is terrifying. At the bottom sits the asset, not a professional spy, not someone with training, just a person with access. Maybe they work in a government ministry. Maybe they're a scientist at a research facility. Maybe they're a secretary who handles classified documents. They're citizens of their own country, living normal lives, unaware they're about to become part of something that will change them forever. Intelligence agencies call this phase spotting. Case officers scan their environment looking for people who fit a profile. Access to valuable information is the first requirement. The second is vulnerability. The recruitment process intelligence agencies have refined over decades follows a systematic approach called SADRAT. Spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, agent handling and termination. Each phase is deliberate. Each phase is calculated. You're at a diplomatic reception in Warsaw. A mid-level official from the Defense Ministry mentions he's struggling with his daughter's medical bills. He says it casually, almost as a joke, but the case officer across from him files that information away. 3 weeks later, they run into each other at a coffee shop. What a coincidence. They talk about families, about the rising cost of healthcare, about how hard it is to make ends meet on a government salary. The case officer is sympathetic, understanding, a friend. This is the development phase, and it can take months or even years. The approach comes when the relationship feels natural. The case officer might offer help, a loan perhaps, or they might appeal to something deeper. The MICE framework explains why people betray their countries. Money, ideology, compromise, and ego. Those are the 4 motivations that case officers exploit. The Defense Ministry official has money problems. That's his pressure point. The case officer presses it gently at first. Just share some documents. Nothing too sensitive, just enough to pay off those medical bills. The official agrees because he feels he has no choice. He's now an asset. Here's what most people don't understand about assets. They're not professional intelligence officers. They don't receive formal training in spycraft, though they might be taught some basic techniques. They're amateurs thrust into a professional's game. They photograph documents in bathroom stalls. They memorize conversations from meetings. They live with constant fear of discovery because they know what happens to traitors in their country. But some assets don't stay at the bottom of the ladder. Principal agents represent the next level up. These are assets who've proven themselves reliable enough to manage other assets. Intelligence agencies prefer this cellular structure because it provides protection. If one agent gets compromised, the others remain safe. The case officer never directly meets most of the network. They work through the principal agent as a cutout, maintaining distance and deniability. Think of it like a franchise operation. The case officer is corporate headquarters. The principal agent is the regional manager. The individual assets are employees who never meet anyone from corporate. If one employee gets caught, they can't identify the regional manager. If the regional manager gets caught, they can't identify most of the other employees. And nobody can identify corporate. This cellular organization is how intelligence networks survive. The principal agent in Prague manages 4 other assets. One works in the Interior Ministry. Another has access to police surveillance records. A third is a journalist with connections to political circles. The fourth is a military logistics officer. None of them know each other. Each believes they're the only one providing information. The principal agent collects their intelligence, passes it to the case officer through dead drops, pre-arranged hiding places where documents are left to be picked up later, and collects payment to distribute to the network. The principal agent has climbed higher on the ladder, but they're still working for one side. What happens when someone decides to work for both? Double agents occupy the most dangerous and valuable position in the entire espionage hierarchy. They're agents who initially work for one intelligence service but then volunteer for or get recruited by a second service. Most often, they're feeding disinformation to one side while remaining loyal to the other. Or they're genuinely serving both, playing each against the other for maximum profit or survival. The complexity here is staggering. A double agent must maintain perfect cover with both services. They must remember which information they've shared with whom. They must provide valuable enough intelligence to both sides to remain trusted while protecting their true allegiance, if they even have one. The tradecraft required is exceptional. One mistake, one inconsistency in their story, and they're exposed. And exposure for a double agent doesn't mean dismissal. It means death. The threat of execution is actually the most common method of turning a captured agent into a double agent. You're an asset working for American intelligence, and the local security service arrests you. They have evidence. They have witnesses. They have photographs of you photographing classified documents. You face decades in prison or worse. Then they offer you a choice. Work for us instead. Feed false information to your American handlers. Become our instrument of deception. Or die. Most people choose survival. But here's where the ladder gets truly twisted. Some double agents aren't created through coercion. They volunteer. They approach a foreign intelligence service and offer their services while still working for their original employer. These are often the most damaging because they're motivated by something stronger than fear. Money usually, sometimes ideology. Occasionally ego, the need to feel powerful, to believe they're smarter than everyone around them. The most valuable double agents are intelligence officers themselves, people who already work for CIA or FBI or MI6, who already have security clearances and access to the most sensitive information their countries possess. When one of these officers turns, the damage is catastrophic. They don't just compromise individual operations, they compromise entire networks of assets. Dozens of people who trusted their government to protect them suddenly find themselves arrested, interrogated, executed. The Soviets had a name for these intelligence officers who betrayed their own services. They called them golden sources. And two of the most devastating golden sources in American intelligence history were operating at exactly the same time, managed by the same KGB officer, causing damage that took decades to fully understand. One worked for the CIA, the other worked for the FBI. Both climbed to positions of significant authority within their organizations. Both had access to the identities of American assets operating in the Soviet Union, and both were willing to sell those names for money. Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington on April 16, 1985. He was a 31-year veteran of the CIA, a case officer who specialized in Russian intelligence services. He spoke Russian. He'd worked in Ankara, New York, Mexico City. He knew how the game was played because he'd been playing it his entire career. He was assigned to the CIA's Soviet and East European division at Langley. He had access to everything. The names of Soviet officials working for American intelligence, the methods used to communicate with them, the locations of dead drops, the identities of CIA officers operating undercover in Moscow. He walked into that embassy and volunteered. He didn't wait to be recruited. He didn't get caught and flipped. He walked in and offered to sell out his country for money. His motivation wasn't ideology. He didn't believe in communism. He didn't think America was wrong or the Soviets were right. He had debts. He wanted a bigger house, nicer cars, a lifestyle his government salary couldn't support. So he sold names. Within months, the KGB began arresting American assets. Dmitry Polyakov, a Soviet general who'd been passing intelligence to the CIA for decades, arrested, executed. Sergei Motorin, a KGB officer working for the FBI, arrested, executed. Valery Martinov, another KGB officer feeding information to American intelligence, arrested, executed. The list went on. A dozen Soviet and Eastern Bloc officials who'd risked everything to help the United States, all of them betrayed by one man who wanted money. The CIA knew something was wrong. Assets were disappearing too quickly. The Soviets were wrapping up American operations with reckless abandon, which was unusual. Standard procedure would be to eliminate assets slowly to avoid exposing the source. But Moscow didn't care about protecting Ames. The decision to immediately arrest everyone he'd compromised came from the highest political levels. They initially suspected Edward Lee Howard, another CIA officer, who'd also been passing information to the Soviets. But then 3 more assets disappeared, people Howard couldn't have known about. That's when they realized there was another mole. It took 9 years to catch him. 9 years during which Ames continued his espionage, continued passing documents through dead drops around Washington, continued collecting payments. The KGB eventually paid him $1.88 million. When he was finally arrested in 1994, he admitted everything. He showed no remorse. He was unabashed about his motivation. Money. Just money, nothing more complicated than greed. But he wasn't working alone in the sense that he was the only American betraying his country to the same handlers. At the exact same time, Ames was selling CIA secrets, another man was selling FBI secrets to the same KGB officer. Viktor Cherkashin ran both of them. Robert Hanssen approached Soviet intelligence in 1979, years before Ames. He was an FBI counterintelligence agent, which meant his job was literally to catch spies. He knew every technique the Bureau used to identify foreign intelligence officers. He knew which Soviet officials the FBI was watching. He knew about technical operations, bugs planted in Soviet facilities, tunnel operations under embassies, and he sold all of it. His first major betrayal was Dmitry Polyakov, the same Soviet general Ames would later also compromise. Polyakov was passing enormous amounts of intelligence to the CIA while rising through the Soviet military ranks. Hanssen gave him up. Polyakov was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Hanssen stopped spying for a few years after that, then started again in 1985, the same year Ames volunteered. For the next 15 years, he operated inside the FBI's counterintelligence division, the very unit responsible for finding moles. He sold about 6,000 classified documents, nuclear war strategies, weapons technology developments, the entire US counterintelligence program. He used dead drops, encrypted communications, every clandestine method he'd been trained to detect. When Ames was arrested in '94, it explained many of the asset losses from the 80s, but not all of them. 2 cases remained unsolved. The FBI and CIA formed a joint mole hunting team. They created a list of everyone who had access to the compromised operations. They gave the investigation a code name, Greysuit. They spent years searching. Then in 2000, the FBI paid $7 million to a former KGB agent for a file on an anonymous American mole. The file contained recordings, documents, enough information to identify Hanssen through fingerprint and voice analysis. They arrested him in 2001. He'd been spying for 22 years. His motivation was also purely financial. No ideology. No political beliefs, just money. The existence of 2 moles operating simultaneously inside America's premier intelligence agencies, both run by the same KGB officer, both motivated by nothing more than greed, represents the ultimate corruption of the espionage power ladder. These weren't assets recruited in foreign countries, they weren't principal agents managing networks, they were intelligence officers who climbed to positions of trust and authority within their own organizations, then used that authority to destroy the very networks they were supposed to protect. The damage can't be fully calculated. The human cost is measured in executions, in agents who died believing their government would protect them. The strategic cost is measured in operations that failed, in intelligence that never reached decision-makers, in adversaries who gained insights into American capabilities they should never have possessed. And the structural cost is the erosion of trust within the intelligence community itself. After Ames and Hanssen, how do you trust anyone? How do you know the person sitting across from you in a classified briefing isn't already working for the other side? The answer is, you don't. You implement more security measures, more polygraphs, more monitoring, more compartmentalization. You assume everyone is a potential threat until proven otherwise. You build systems where no single person has access to everything. But determined insiders can still find ways through. The ladder doesn't end with double agents. It ends with the realization that the ladder itself is a fiction. There's no neat hierarchy in espionage. There's just humans with access to secrets and other humans willing to pay for those secrets. Some people climb the ladder by serving one side faithfully. Others climb by serving multiple sides simultaneously. And some reach the top by betraying everyone who ever trusted them. The espionage game continues because countries need intelligence and people need money or power or validation. As long as those needs exist, someone will always be willing to trade secrets. The ladder will always have someone climbing it. And somewhere, right now, another Ames or Hansen is making a decision that will echo for decades in ways no one will ever publicly acknowledge. The ladder exists because the game never stops. Intelligence agencies will always need information. People will always have access to secrets. And some of those people will always be willing to sell what they know. You can't eliminate the ladder by catching the climbers. You can only watch as new ones begin their ascent, motivated by the same forces that drove the ones before them. Money. Ego, ideology, coercion. The cycle doesn't break, it just resets with different names and different faces playing the same roles.